Hello, I'm James Riley from Innovation Oz. Welcome to Street Creds, part of the Cybersecurity, the Digital Backbone podcast series that Innovation Oz is producing in partnership with CyberArk. I have with me today Matt Tett, Managing Director of Enex TestLab, the independent testing laboratory with, I think, a 30-year heritage, Matt. And you're sort of everywhere these days, the Director of the Comms Alliance, the Chair of one of the work streams in the IoT Alliance, a committee member of Standards Australia, along with a bunch of other positions across the industry. So welcome, Matt. We've also got Andrew Slavkovic, Solutions Engineering Manager at Privileged Access Management firm CyberArk for the ANZ region. Welcome, Andrew. Look, I wanted to start, Matt, with you. I'm going to ask you the broadest possible question. As someone who's been involved in testing and accreditation over a very long period of time, lots of standard setting in cybersecurity, at its broadest view, do we have a fit-for-purpose accreditation system? And what are some of the issues?
Yeah, well, it's interesting proposition, James. I think, unfortunately, security is always playing catch up to the rest of technology. And unfortunately, governments and legislation and regulation are also playing catch up even further behind security. So I think we already started behind the eight ball. And it's really difficult when crises like a pandemic or obviously geopolitical relationships start testing, I guess, the politicking with a K rather than the politicking with a C. And that really obviously disrupts traditional industries, but it also provides opportunities for people with malicious intent. So whether they're seeking financial reward or whether they're hacktivists and seeking attention by the media or global scale. So we're seeing a prevalence of scams and people really push to the wall trying to monetize their crimes, and our security teams are really feeling the force of it, and vendors don't slow down on their marketing and product development and things like that. So I think there's a number of stakeholders which are involved in this. It's not just one individual or body which is responsible, and I think we all have a role to play in increasing security, safety, and privacy for everyone. So not just obviously Australians, but obviously everyone in the world. And accreditation is a critical part of that. I think standards are very critical. And with most industries, they talk about best practice. I think in security, we need to talk about good practice. And what does that constitute?
Okay, can you just very briefly, I wonder if you can describe to me what your 2020's been like in terms of Enex and the testing regimes that you have been required to do. I mean, I'm going to guess that business has been booming, but it's been such an odd year. I wouldn't mind if you could just explain that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work that we do, and we've done over 31 years since we came out of the uni, is very bespoke work. So it's not necessarily standards based, and that only goes so far. So if you're a manufacturer or a developer and you engage in bespoke, independent evaluation of your products, then you're generally already one of the leaders in the field. It's not the leaders that we're trying to educate, it's the followers. And the followers need to understand that sometimes it's the soft skills, the areas that are outside what they see their product functionality and features as being, and the benefits to their consumers, or trying to benefit others' consumers by riding on the coattails of a successful product. And some of those are the differentiators where they do incorporate security, safety, and privacy by design, and then look at rolling that out to their field. So trustworthiness is something that you hear a lot mentioned nowadays, and a good example of trustworthiness is banks. At the end of the day, banks have a whole series of mechanisms based around the risks to them, and more particularly the risks to their consumers. So regardless of what those safeguards are, whether they're physical security measures or whether they're sort of intangible insurance policies, if you like, where the consumer is always protected. And so trust is something that a lot of good brands seek to establish in the market, and unless they have their products evaluated, then they're not necessarily going to know. Of course, the people that work internally on their teams are always going to say they're number one and we're the best product. And, the managers aren't going to want to hear that the product that they've just developed isn't necessarily fit for purpose, or is full of Swiss cheese of vulnerabilities. But, in reality, you see the way products get brought to market and have always been brought to market, no one's ever going to do it 100%. And so if they were going to do it 100%, they'd be 6 months late and 10 times over budget rather than 3 months late and 5 times over budget. So, yeah, it's a really difficult situation, I think, for businesses to balance when they're looking at developing technology.
The trust is a trust in cybersecurity it's an unusual term, isn't it? Because we go the full gamut from ideas around zero trust to the trust we would normally associate, as you're saying, with the banking system. And so I'm going to bring Andrew Slavkovic into the conversation now. Andrew, just through your 2020 and from the vantage point of a multinational that operates across various jurisdictions, what are you seeing out there, and how does privileged access management? I suppose we're talking about identity, which is very much linked into the trust equations that the companies have to run. What are you seeing out there?
I guess at the moment, what we're seeing is a lot of digital transformation take place. Obviously, 2020 has been known as the global pandemic, and that's really forced organizations to transform their businesses overnight and look at ways of utilizing something as a service. For example, identity as a service is something now that the government in particular is more palatable in consuming than you think of 5 years ago, where they built traditional on-premise systems. We're also seeing the government more open to the idea of consuming multi-cloud strategy. And what's happened there is you've got the explosion of identities that come as a result of that. So it really has opened up a new world of risk that government agencies must look at.
And just on the on the government accreditation side, Matt, you were saying that they have generally lagged industry, and industry sometimes lags the more nefarious actors out there. So, with the restructure of accreditation at the federal level, has that improved the speed to market, for want of a better term, of those accreditations?
I think if you look at the way, say, in Australia, the government's looked at the review into the cloud certification program, and obviously the demise of the cloud certification program, where it was specifically one product or one service, if you like, that they're looking at, and then the revamp of the IRAP program, they're really looking at not certifying individual products, but they're looking at certifying organizations, if you like. So performing due diligence or an audit on an organization to ensure that they have sufficient policies and procedures and practices in place. And as we all know, in the grand scheme of things, if security gets in the way, then people will generally find a way of circumventing that. And that's no different whether you work in an organization, whether you're in a home environment or whether you're in a government department or agency. Sure, it sets, I guess, a standard that people are expected to follow and some awareness or guidance material that they're supposed to understand. But in the real world, humans are humans, and we shouldn't blame humans for trying to be productive and get their work done. But unfortunately, a lot of the incidents that we see occur are because people have circumvented the protocols or the procedures which have been put in place. And we see similar things in the US. So when they enact legislation designed to protect, I guess, or not protect the manufacturers, but to assess the manufacturers' technologies, again, it's more reactive rather than proactive. So Europe, same thing, GDPR, the headlines were all about how big the penalties were for the privacy breaches, not about how big the privacy breaches were. So, British Airways really copped a big one, a number of larger organisations. So it was good for the coffers, for the funds, but it wasn't necessarily good for the individuals whose privacy had been compromised. And I think that's something that we really need to look at. Is we don't want to hear about the breaches. We don't want to see the breaches. We want to make sure that the breaches are prevented before they actually occur. And that's one of the biggest issues that we have. Is you can have standards, you can have regulation, but you really need to make sure they're measurable and they're effective. They're actually working effectively, that's a really critical thing.
So, Andrew, I'll bring you in here. With the IRAP certification in particular, how's that working? How is it? It's obviously been stress tested in 2020. What's your view of their ability to accredit products and services at a speed that is helpful to to protecting government organisations? And then, as Matt's saying, how do you then kind of ensure that one-off accreditation becomes an ongoing framework for successfully defending?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the ACSC has done a really good job of improving the speed to market, which they provide advice and guidance around. And I think a good example of that is COVID. I think it was in May this year, they provided very detailed criteria around what is best practice for an individual going home now and working, which is great to see. And I think if you look at the ISM control framework, you'll also notice that there's a whole section around remote access. So in theory, an individual going home, the organisation should have confidence that if they've followed the IRAP framework, that they're going to have a level of assurance that they're going to be secure. Just to add to that, I think we've also seen an increase on attacks against the government this year. And obviously, people going from home, the malicious actors now have time on their hands as well. They're increasing their efforts against government agencies. And we also see the government responding in providing timely advice. Another example there would be around the healthcare industry. There was a ransomware attack advice given in August this year to say that, hey, we see malicious actors now targeting the health industry because they see it as a perfect opportunity to now disrupt the business even more.
I think we've seen public sector audits at state and federal level that have highlighted some probably not ideal cybersecurity practices across various government departments. New South Wales had a particular problem in this regard in the last 12 or 18 months. So, Matt, given the increased activity, the hacking activity focused on governments, where are we at now?
Yeah, I think we're definitely putting increased, formalised processes, whereas before it wasn't as clear, and so the guidance is very specific. I mean, we have a lot of industry sectors just in Australia, and obviously government is a critical industry sector for us, or a critical sector for us. And yeah, having something like the independent IRAP assessors able to go out within those agencies and work with the security teams that are working on implementing those procedures and policies and standards are very good. It's the same as private industry with ISO 27001. Not every organisation in Australia is going to accredit themselves to or certify themselves to ISO 27001, but it's a very good framework to actually start building a foundation on. Why start down a different path when there's already a path which has been created? And with any luck, the revised IRAP will actually provide consistency in those fields, and at least when there is an incident, enable ASD or the guys from ACSC to go in and actually identify where, why, how, and what, and then hopefully mitigate any extenuating circumstances that may come from that threat having been realised. Or again, like I said, the key is measurement, and I always focus on measurement. You want to measure before and after, and you want to measure the benefit of implementing those policies and procedures. So you need to draw a baseline somewhere, and once we have that baseline, we can measure the maturity of those departments and agencies' security models rather than just measure them by the number of incidents that they've actually had. It's better to measure the prevention rather than the cure. So definitely.
So Andrew, I saw you nodding quite vigorously during that answer. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I do. I think the compliance frameworks, so something like a NIST has now moved a lot faster to release stuff like zero trust. So we see some of these international standards really working quite agile in the way that they bring to describe to the individual what the best practice for a control is for an emerging tech field. Also, the Internet of Things is another example where something like the NIST has provided special advice and guidance for. So we can see that that standard moves very quickly, which is great. And we can see something like the ISM moving more and more measured and methodical way that maybe hasn't, well, just started to look at things like how the Internet of Things is going to impact the government in years to come.
I should have just jumped in there. NIST, of course, is the National Institute of Science and Technology. It's a US-based standards body. Have I got that right? And the ISM, the Internet Information Security Manual, of the Australian government that Andrew was just talking about. In terms of greater government industry collaborations, is that those kinds of standards bodies, whether it's edicts coming from NIST or an Australian organisation or the ISO, is the collaboration? Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, so we could, in theory, have greater collaboration at those levels. If something like the NIST has already thought out Internet of Things, what the security controls or mechanisms are required to provide assurance in that environment, there's nothing stopping us from leveraging off that locally for the government to say, hey, let's see how these controls stack up in our control framework.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're doing within the IoT Alliance Australia, and our work stream, which focuses on cybersecurity and network resilience, isn't reinventing the wheel. It's taking special publications like the ones from NIST. There's also the European agency, ENISA, which have really good guidelines, which both the UK and Australia government has released a series of 13 good practices that people should follow when they're developing or designing IoT products and services. And so we've built a Trustmark security certification program around those. So the framework and the delivery of the actual certification itself doesn't mean that the certification framework is the judge of what constitutes good or best practice when it comes to IoT, but it relies on organisations like ENISA and NIST to set those with their members, and then that allows a reproducible system to be, I guess, rolled out on a wider scale rather than just bespoke individual testing for vendors, and that's proven to be really well accepted. And it's obviously collaboration between industry and government departments and agencies, which is very, very critical. In late 2019, the 5 ministers from Canada, US, UK, New Zealand, and Australia all signed a statement of intent to support both industry and government for IoT security goals, and that includes working closely with obviously the technology industries and the security industries to ensure that products are providing better security, safety, and privacy. And the issue when you start talking about Internet of Things and connected devices is it goes beyond your traditional information security. So it's not just looking after the data which is coming off those devices, but also the safety of people. When you're looking at things like healthcare, medical, automotive, even things within the household, and also privacy, very critically privacy. So it's a far bigger concern because there's a far greater amount of, I guess, background data which is being collected on individuals and their behaviours and what they're doing, even location-based things. I mean, we have watches now, we have phones, we have everything has a GPS tracker built into it, cars. It's so much easier to predict where people are going, when they're going, what they're doing, and that's all gold for criminals.
Yeah, I'm interested in this the Trustmark issue that you've just mentioned, and the ability to sort of market yourselves, companies to market, I don't know, business to business or business to government products. Do you think that'll ever reach a retail level where the kind of global accreditations or global trust brands will drive consumer behaviour?
You'd like to hope so, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can embed, if your typical home consumer starts realising that their security, safety, and privacy is at risk because of buying cheap products or products that purport to be one thing and deliver something else, then you'd like to imagine that they'd invest slightly more and buy a more trusted or secure product. And again, that will then lift the cheaper products into that market to say, okay, well, there's the unique selling point that this vendor is actually making, is claiming to be a a trusted product. Therefore, we want to be a trusted product as well. How do we achieve that? And having that through independence and having a government endorsement or an industry endorsement and a label, a bit like the energy rating system. So you look at fridges and white goods where they have, the 5 stars or the 4 stars. I'm sure some consumers would absolutely be influenced by that. And if there's a safety or security or privacy rating system which has been applied to consumer electronic devices, then very much so. We'd like to see that. But obviously at the beginning, it is the larger organisations, smart cities, things like that, where they are integrating larger, wider scale, more expensive or expansive IoT environments that aren't so easy to change. You can't just change something out every 3 months or 6 months, as most consumers sort of have the benefit of being able to do in their household. It's not going to benefit critical organisations or significant national interests if you've just invested several $100 million and you're told 6 months later that it's obsolete and you need to change it because it has inherent security flaws. So yeah, it's an interesting proposition.
It is. Okay, Andrew, I want to talk about identity-based security, and I suppose we should be talking about it in relation to IoT as much as the personal or corporate identity issues that we would normally associate it with. So describe to me, in the work from home scenario, or at least in the accelerated digital transformation, how has the kind of identity-based security management or privileged access management, how's that kind of bubbled up, if you like?
Yeah, so I think during COVID, we've noticed that the individual has had to go home to work. So we see identity being the real critical layer for security to provide assurance that that individual can interact with the corporate network and remain safe. So being an extension of your home network becoming your corporate network. I think from an identity security perspective, we really want to provide the least amount of privilege for that individual to be effective in doing their job. So that means, from our perspective, is enforcing least privilege. But obviously, with that comes the inherent risk that the user is going to potentially need more privileges as they go about their day-to-day job. So we talk about here providing just-in-time privilege as a mechanism to escalate that privilege as and when they need it, but then to strip it back when it's no longer required. And when you think about that from an attack vector perspective, it's quite powerful, because if we assume breach mindset and that individual account is compromised, they're very limited in what they can do from a compromised perspective. They'll have to then go and discover another account or another identity that is more powerful to be able to move laterally within the network to obtain whatever target they want. So moving from home looks like users going home using any device they want. They should have the confidence that they can fire up their device and interact with whatever it is they need. So we're also seeing that any user under normal circumstances can become a privileged user. You think of interacting with an app, it may not be a privileged activity per se, but it is definitely sensitive data in there as well.
And Matt, how does that, the scenarios that Andrew's just described, how is that applied to IoT? Is it the same thing, but kind of across billions more devices?
Yeah, well, traditionally in security, there's 2 types of identities. There's the human, the individual, and then there's the machine. And so each device has an identity as well, if you like. And I think a lot of the past has been talking about machine-to-machine interaction and authentication particularly, so ensuring that a device that's trying to connect is the device that it's supposed to be connecting. And the same with the user. If you can identify the user and the credentials that the user has provided, and it's a tricky thing. I mean, passwords died years ago, but at the end of the day, people still rely on trying to memorize, these greater and greater areas of responsibility and not write them down and don't stick them to the back of your keyboard and use a password manager, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, anyone can give anyone else their password and get access to it. So you see a lot of multi-factor authentication, and we're beginning to see the same thing now with devices. But again, the manufacturers try and develop their products to be easily connected, plug and play, turn it on, connect to the nearest Wi-Fi network, and away you go. And then even worse, connect across networks where, it's not network specific. So you can't even lock a device down to a specific network. It's trying to always reach outside those bounds and connect back to the mothership, if you like, whether it's a cloud-based service or whether it's another service. And it doesn't take much for a man in the middle to actually intercept that information. And then, as Andrew said, it depends on the volume of the information or the value of the information and how much information can you gain from one device. Are you able to escalate your privileges to be able to get access to more information? There's a whole lot of controls and policies and procedures which need to be thought about by the manufacturers as they're developing their convenient technologies to ensure that they do identify both machines correctly and humans and individuals correctly as the proper user. Biometrics has helped to a certain extent. Apple's been really big on that with their touch and then their Face ID. But again, they're not perfect technologies either. If someone can get into a back end, then they're still getting access to the information. So, yeah, it's not a perfect science, and I don't think it ever will be. We've just got to keep working on being that one step ahead rather than one step behind.
Yeah. Look, I'm going to start drawing this to a close. We're having our conversation in the last days of 2020, a quite tumultuous year. I guess our listeners will probably be hearing it in the early days of 2021. So I wanted to put to both of you, and maybe we'll start with Andrew. Sydney seems like it's about to go into a hard lockdown across the greater Sydney area. We've already had this incredible experience this year of accelerated digital transformation and work from home and all that stuff, and there's going to be plenty more of it to come in the coming year. I wonder, can you describe to me what the next year holds for cybersecurity? What are some of the mega trends, and what are some of the specific trends in this, that you will see in Australia? And I'll ask the same question of Matt Tett.
Yeah, sure. So I think where the future lies here is we want to enable the workforce, we want to enable the remote workforce, but we want to restrict the amount of privileges that they have to do their job. And obviously that is a difficult endeavor. So we want to look at ways that we can use something like an AI to actually determine what level of privilege that user is going to need, and then automatically predict it so they're not hampered to do their job in any way. But using that technology as well, we can detect malicious trends. And think of the movie Minority Report, for example. We can block something before it actually takes place. So we want to use AI more in our product set to determine a sequence of actions that could result in, based on our past experience, a malicious or suspicious sequence of activities. And we want to automatically take action to prevent that from escalating.
Matt, you want to put your crystal ball into good use?
Yeah, I think I've just booted it up, but it's failed. So, I think it was halfway through a firmware update that it hasn't been able to give me what the future was. Mind you, it did the same in 2019, and I don't think anyone could have predicted what 2020 would have held. So, yeah, look, I think, as I mentioned before, security is one thing. Information security is very critical. It's something that I guess information technology practitioners never perfected, and I think that's something that we're still paying for on a daily basis, and a lot of organizations pay for on a daily basis, trying to fit square pegs in round holes. I think when you're starting to talk about the plethora of internet connected devices across all gamuts of life, we really need to start looking at the safety and privacy. So privacy of the information, the safety of the systems which are being put into place, because now it's going to start affecting human lives, not just human information. And I think that's what we're going to see a real big change over the next year or two is that focus on safety and making sure that the machines aren't out to get us, as it were.
All right, Matt Tett from Enex TestLab, thank you very much for joining us, and also to you, Andrew Slavkovic from CyberArk. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.